Welcome to our first lecture in criminology. In this lecture, I'm going to lay out some of the ideas from sociology that I think are relevant for any study of criminology. We want to look at how crime is defined by societies. Prior to the 1700s, most explanations of crime and deviance were usually of a religious or spiritual nature. The belief back then was that crime was the result of either demonic possession or the individual deviant person's abuse of his or her free will. You can see some evidence of a theological perspective on deviance in the Bible, the Christian Bible. The Apostle Paul makes three main points about a crime. Paul argues that law was given by God to define sin and crime. So it's clearly a theological perspective. Law is given by God. The second point Paul makes is that man commits crime because of his fallen nature, because he's a sinner. And Paul's third major point was that God ordains governments to deter and punish crime. So the Apostle Paul in the Bible then is giving us both a theory of why crime is committed. Men are sinners. He's justifying the law, and he's justifying government's application of the law and enforcement of the law in terms of being God's will. So clearly a theological perspective on crime in the Bible. In the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, the theological theories of crime took a fatalistic turn under the influence of the followers of John Calvin, a prominent theologian. Probably have heard of him. So the emphasis here was on the sovereign will of God to the exclusion of the free will of man. Criminals were seen as people who were predestined to be criminals by God. In other words, you didn't have the free will to choose to be a criminal or not. It was God's will. God made you a criminal. So this is a bit of a change from what Paul was arguing in the Bible. Not necessarily a contradiction, but a new spin on the theological conception of crime. What Paul and John Calvin have in common is that they seem to agree that criminals are sinners. When religion teaches that all men are born sinners, it kind of makes no sense to ask what causes crime, because the answer is self-evident. It's sin. We still have these religious teachings with us today, and they still have influence today. And so you can see why a study of them fits into a criminology course. That said, this is a course based on the scientific method, which involves using evidence to test theories. So our focus in this class is on science, not faith. So I'm not going to be dealing any further with faith-based conceptions of crime. Still, we need to be aware of how faith-based ideas might affect public policy, because we are going to be talking about policy. There are still many people whose view of crime is influenced by theology, and who are in position of influencing policy. Now let's turn to sociology. What is deviance? Deviance is universal because people everywhere violate social norms. A social norm is any rule or expectation for behavior. So deviance is any violation of a set of norms. So norms can be things that are written into criminal law, but they can also just be things that distinguish between what is rude and what is polite. We will define deviant as any person who commits an act of deviance, any person who violates a social norm. Let's move down to the section on traditional views of deviance and deviance. We'll look at a range of perspectives. Sociologists are likely to focus on the social construction of deviance, on how societies and cultures define who and what is deviant. This is what we might consider the social constructionist perspective. Sociology. There are also biological perspectives, psychological, and so forth. We might touch on some of those in this course, but we'll focus more on the sociological theories. Absolutist and moral views. This is the perspective that comes down to us from the theological perspective on crime. These are people who believe that certain behaviors are always deviant because God said so, or because there's simply a rule out there that says that this behavior is deviant. This behavior is always wrong or immoral. So people who argue that things should be criminal because of their religious teachings are taking the absolutist view, also known as the moral view. Not all moralistic conceptions of crime are theological in nature. That's why I gave you a different heading for this slide. Can you think of examples of moralistic conceptions of deviance that are not driven by theology? I'm going to ask you to think of one. See if you can think of one, and maybe we can discuss it in our open discussion board. Medical and sociopathological views. The idea here is that people who commit deviant or criminal acts are inherently sick. I haven't yet distinguished between deviance and crime as clearly as I should have. Deviance is any violation of a social norm, no matter how significant or insignificant. Crime is violation of social norms that are written into criminal law. So when I'm talking about deviance, it's a broader category than crime is. Medical and sociopathological views. This perspective has become known as the medicalization of deviance. This is a relatively new term in the world of sociology and criminology. The idea that people are committing acts of deviance or crime because there's something physically or psychologically wrong with them. That's one perspective. Another perspective on deviance is what you might call the statistical view. Any behavior that is abnormal, that is uncommon, statistically uncommon, might be considered deviant. So being the tallest person in the class might make you a deviant because you're statistically uncommon. Are we going to define the tallest person in our class as deviant? Probably not, but it could happen. Sometimes we define people whose skin color is not of the norm, who are in a minority that has a different skin color. We might define them as deviant. I'm not advocating this position, but this has occurred in the past. So this is just me giving you an example of the statistical view of deviance. Those people over there, they look funny, they look different from us, they're probably deviant. There's something wrong with them. They don't look right. That's one example of the statistical view. People who are unusual in some way. Again, I'm not advocating any of these views, I'm just presenting their existence to you. If you want to know what I personally believe, I prefer this perspective that I'm going to present now. The relativity of deviance. Deviance is relative rather than absolute, in my opinion. An act that is deviant in one context may not be deviant in another, and we're going to come up with some examples. Variation by time. An act that is considered deviant in one time might not be considered deviant in another time period. Can you give me an example of something that was considered deviant in the past that is considered acceptable today? Now, can you give me the opposite? Can you give me an example of something that is considered deviant today but was acceptable in the past? Here's my example. This is an old cigarette advertisement from the 1920s. An ancient prejudice has been removed. It used to be considered deviant for a woman to smoke tobacco. Beginning in the 1920s, more and more women began to smoke, and it became acceptable for women to use tobacco. And you can see that social change being addressed in this advertisement. Related to tobacco use, 50 years ago, people would smoke cigarettes in a college classroom. There might even be ashtrays in some classrooms. Today, that would be considered extremely deviant to do so. So variation by time. Things that are considered deviant in one time might not be deviant in another time. Variation by place. Can you give me an example of something that's deviant in one part of the world, but normal in another part of the world? Here's my example. A woman taking her top off in public would be considered deviant in most places, But on some beaches, not all beaches, but on some beaches, that is considered acceptable. Topless beaches, you're allowed to take your top off. Deviant in one part of the world, but acceptable on a topless beach.